Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today, I would like to continue our conversation about agriculture, and I want to talk about land divisions. We've talked a little bit about agricultural landscapes in terms of what kind of farming we do and where we do it, but now I want to talk really about this idea of once you have permanent food production, then you have dedicated land, right? So your first question is going to be about permanent food production. Permanent food production, and by that I mean agriculture, leads to which of the following? Job specialization, cities, marriage laws, or private property? Well, the answer is actually all of these, and I know that that's not a choice on the slide, but it leads to all of these things. Once you settle down, and we'll talk about this more when we start talking about settlements in the settling down unit, you have people can specialize in jobs that they're good at. You need to have support systems and towns, right? So cities. Marriage laws we're going to come back to later on because once you own land, you want to make sure that it is going to your beneficiary, right? You would like to make sure that it's going to continue to be in your family, maybe, whatever. And also, the bottom line is if you're growing your own food, you want to own that land. And so private property in terms of holdings, right, land holdings, is something that comes out of agriculture as well. So ultimately, we start out really kind of with the idea of fragmented farms, and so farmers would live in farming villages or hamlets, and the field surrounded the settlement, and you'd have single parcels of land, and any farm in particular may actually consist of several separate parcels of land. It kind of depends on how it's divided, how it's been passed through families, things like that. And in Asia and Southern Europe, you typically see rectangular parcels, and in Western and Central Europe, you tend to see narrow strips of land. Okay, and so when we start looking at this kind of map of original holdings, you're going to see a lot of fragmentation. But as time goes on, there seems to be a push for consolidation. It's like, okay, well, I have a field next to your field, you have a field next to my other field. I'll sell you mine, you sell yours, I'll trade it, whatever. Or I want to go do something else. So I'll sell you my land and I'm going to do something else with that money. And so you start to really get consolidation of land holdings in most of Europe and most of Asia. And so instead of having these little like spot farms, you end up having these larger farms and reduced fragmentation. Now you'll notice that I haven't said anything about the United States, and we'll talk about we have a very special land system that's really unique, and that is because we are so much newer in terms of settlement. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that you also see was as this consolidation is that you get these unit block farms. And so this property is a single piece of land that is contiguous, which means it's all touching. And this is really what you see in places where you have colonization, right? As opposed to these fragmented and then consolidated farms, unit block farms are where someone came in and planned out the parcels of land, and then farmers could actually buy or be granted those pieces of land. Okay. Now, in the United States, we have a rectangular survey system, and so pretty much all of the land in the country has been surveyed into these rectangle shapes, right? And so that can include city, urban land, so that's the townships, or like farmland. It can be rural. So you get this sectioning out and gridding of basically the entire country, right? And this, I love this picture because it actually shows you exactly what I am talking about. Now, one of the things that you'll also see is that the geography of the land is very much going to affect the parceling, right? This rectangular parceling. And so in the picture I showed you before, you can see these nice, pretty kind of fat rectangles. But if you have river areas or hilly areas or roads or railroads that were put in before the land was parceled, for instance, then you're going to get what are called long lot farms. And these are very common all over the world along rivers, particularly. And you can see a picture here. You've got these long lots, right? These strips, if you will, of farming. You've got all the land parceled out, and that's great, but you're going to need ports in order to import and export goods, right? So maybe you need things and then you can export out, right, to make a profit, and that's very exciting, right? So you not only have to have a system where you can have private property, but you have to have a transport system as well, and rivers are often going to be one of the best ways to transport large amounts of goods inexpensively. So to that end, think about a big river that has both rectangular parceling and long lot parceling, and that would be the Mississippi River. Well, what is the port there? It is New Orleans. So, which group actually benefited most from the United States acquisition of the port of New Orleans? Native American Indians in the Southwest, fur trappers in the Columbia River Valley, farmers in the Ohio River Valley, or gold miners in Northern California? Well, anyone who's trading really could benefit from this acquisition, right, of the port. But it turns out that it's going to be farmers in the Ohio River Valley because they are able to ship their grains, produce, whatever they're growing, out, and they're able to bring their inputs in, right, which is very good. Okay, so let's talk about this private property. So we take a little moment there, but let's talk about this private property situation. If you're going to have private property, you need to be able to let everyone else know that it belongs to you. And so fences are the way that we do that. Now, different cultures have different kinds of fences, and the fences really, really reflect the geography, what is available as far as fence material. And so you get these very characteristic boundary markers in different regions. So like New England and Northern Europe and the Yucatan, where you have lots of, just for example, where you have lots of stone, right? They're going to have stone walls. And so here you can see a very typical New England property fence, right? In the Great Plains, you don't have a lot of trees, you don't have a lot of stones, right? You have a lot of land, and you need to cover that with minimal materials. And so you see a lot of barbed wire. You have this kind of open fencing. So you've got the post from, the minimal number of trees that you have, and then you have this metal barbed wire, which is fairly inexpensive, and you can carry a lot of it, right? As opposed to these split rail wood fences that you find in Appalachia, which is covered with trees, and so you have an ample supply of forest. This is a lot of materials to carry. The plots are also smaller here, partly because of the mountains, right? As opposed to the Great Plains, where you are again covering long distances with minimal materials. Now, sometimes none of these things work out very well, and people look at living fences, right? And these are going to be the hedges and hedgerows that Europe is really famous for. Now, here's an interesting thing, though. One would think, oh, a living fence, that's really great. But they tend to actually promote this sense of isolation and confinement much more than open fences. And you can look at that in suburbia as the difference between a chain link fence, which really invites neighbors to interact with each other, versus a solid wooden fence, which creates this sense of confinement where you are the only ones in your area, your world, whatever you're doing. And so that's kind of the suburban equivalent of the barbed wire versus the hedgerow. Okay, so let's talk about where do we put stuff. I am going to be totally honest with you. We are talking about the von Thunen model because it is part of the AP curriculum, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I want you to be familiar with it. And essentially, von Thunen developed a model about which crops to cultivate in relation to urban centers, right? And so basically it's a theoretical system. It's based on the idea that you have an isolated state that has no trade connections. It assumes that all farmers living from the same distance to the market are going to have equal access to it, which is not necessarily true. I mean, that depends a lot on road systems and geography. And basically, it was a model created to study the influence of distance from a market to the transport cost influence on the type and intensity of agriculture. So basically, how far away you are and how much it costs to get to the market is going to change what you grow. And that seems pretty obvious if you think about it. And this model has been modified multiple times to account for things like rivers or whatever, okay? But basically, it works like this. If you have something that has a low market value and has a long lifespan, like grain, that's going to be grown far away from the urban center. Okay, if you have something that is perishable or that is very expensive, it's going to be grown closer. Okay, transport costs actually turn out to not increase as drastically with distance from markets, but land value does, and this is called the bid rent value. And so the farther away from the urban area you get, the cheaper land is, and the closer in you get. And so what you find is that you find not just about the hardiness of the crop, right? The persistence, so grain versus, say, tomatoes or something. But you also find that more extensive crops that need more land are going to be grown farther away from the city than the intensive crops that don't need as much land, and that has to do with how much the land itself costs. So that's kind of the von Thunen model in a nutshell. Okay, so you just saw a question there. Just kidding, we're not having that question. So, hey, yay. All right, so we still do use the von Thunen model a little bit in terms of identifying what's growing where and looking at cost benefit analysis and stuff like that. And so it's been updated. So you have the central city, which was the market, right? And then again, you have the same idea of having those very intensive crops, the market gardens, the feedlots. You've got the perishables, and you can see that the perishables have moved out a little bit. And that's partly because of refrigeration, which was in the slide a couple of slides ago. Okay. Then you start moving into livestock because you still have to get those to market, but they used to be able to walk on their own. Now we can truck them, and that's great. And then you have your grain farming, and then you have your actual like livestock ranching. This is going to be where the grazing is happening, the open pastures, the big, open range kind of stuff. Okay. And then we're going to skip the non-agriculture. We're not going to talk about that. But anyway, so this is Uruguay, and you can see this is the model that's predicted by von Thunen, and this is the actual sort of zones of agriculture that you find. Here's your market gardening, and of course here's the city central, right? The central city, which was Montevideo. And then you have the dairying area, right? And then you have your commercial grain farming, and you have your livestock ranching. And it's a little bit different, but it's really close. And so the von Thunen model is pretty accurate in terms of making these predictions about where stuff will be. But also think about if you want to start a farm, it would be really helpful to kind of know where would be a good place for you to do that so you can maximize your costs. And so that is a really helpful feature of the von Thunen model. All right, so let's talk a little bit about agriculture, population, and technology. Okay, so here's your first question. A major factor in the destruction of the Amazon rainforest is the movement of people from rural to urban areas, attempt of native peoples to end illegal drug trafficking, need for more farmland, or a growing population that requires more grain production. So remember, one of the things we talked about was the slash and burn agriculture, and that's what this question is asking about it. Why is this happening? Well, a growing population requires more food, right? And so you need to have more farmland to do that. And what happens is that throughout history, actually, since we've been domesticating plants and animals, and we've been mastering our own food production, increased food production leads to surplus food. A surplus food allows for a population to increase, right? When you have a population that increases, you need to grow more food, right? And so the food supply becomes limiting for a bit, can actually lead to starvation, which is a real problem. And then farmers are forced to to develop better technologies and figure out better ways to use the land. And when you do that, you get more food. And so you have this spiraling of the pressure for better farming and an increasing population because of it. So there have been three really big agricultural revolutions. Obviously, the first one was domestication of plants and animals, having agriculture at all, which allowed for the rise of cities, which is what the whole next unit is about. Then in the 17th and 18th century, mostly in Europe, and a lot of the dominating technologies are going to come out of Europe, and you have this increase in efficiency and yield because of these new technologies. You also have industrialization. I mean, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, right? Is going to follow shortly after this, but it really begins in agriculture and looking at changes in agriculture. And then we also have the development of cash crops, so the coffee and the tea and the chocolate and the bananas and all of that stuff. Okay, oh, so out of those, which of these is a cash crop? Potato, corn, and almonds are all for food, right? But rubber is a cash crop. Okay, and rubber is grown plantation style, as we talked about in one of the other video notes. All right, now the third agricultural revolution is called the Green Revolution, and this is what you see today. Modern farming is a result of this third revolution, agricultural revolution, and we see hybridization to make hardier and more productive crops, and we also see a switch to monoculture. Once we find something that grows really well in an area, that's all we're going to grow. Now, the good side is the higher yield. The downside is increased inputs, right? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But in a nutshell, the Green Revolution was able to temporarily close the gap between food production by giving you these hybrid varieties that are more productive and developing inputs that allow for higher yield. And it actually eliminated starvation for the most part in some countries, and that is really amazing. And so what you see is it starts with wheat and a crop called dwarf wheat, and we also see a monoculture of corn and rice because the inputs and these great hybrids of all of these. So wheat, corn, and rice are all what you see today are all products of the Green Revolution and the research that began in the 1940s. For about 20 years, crops began being introduced in the 1960s. This work is still being done today. It originated in Mexico. That's where the first plantings were, Mexico and Central America. They moved into Pakistan and India, and currently researchers are working in Africa with a lot of these crops. Okay. Now, when we talk about the Green Revolution, there are basically three big changes. You've got the biochemical innovations, the mechanical innovations, and the social innovations. So the biochemical would be things like the seeds, the hybrid seeds, and the inorganic fertilizers and pesticides. And the consequences of that were increased yields, increased pest control, although that was temporary, and we'll talk about that later on, increased costs because all this stuff is more expensive, and there's unfortunately some pretty intensive environmental degradation that goes with that, which we've talked about when we talked about soil quality and water availability and stuff like that. A lot of the problems we're having are because of the ways that we're farming, the things that were developed in the Green Revolution. Okay. Now the mechanical, we get a lot of mechanized stuff, right? We get improved transport of crops and inputs, but we also get mechanization of the farming processes themselves. You can have a tractor, a planter, right, or a combine or something, that one person can now do the job of anywhere from 5 to 50 people, right? And that's a really impressive thing. Also the ability to get water onto your crops. So diesel and electric pump powered irrigation, that changed everything, but it also increased the amount of water that we use. So while we now have an ability to control our water, we use way too much of it. We have a decrease in labor, we have an increase in arable land, and we have an increase in market access because of these. Now, this last strand is the social strand. There were a lot of land reforms that went into this. How are you using the land? What are you doing with that? Loans, right? We started seeing more agricultural loans for farmers, and that we saw that talked about a little bit in the video that we watched. And that's going to include microloans in developing nations. And then we also have changes in distribution systems for inputs and outputs, right? And so what you get there is more farm consolidation and better access to technology for poorer communities in the developing world. Yeah, also developed world, but specifically in the developing world. Okay. And this was great, but why can't we rely on the Green Revolution technology to continue to increase yields? Plants can only utilize so much fertilizer, arable land is limited, soil quality is decreasing, water supplies are limited, many pests have become resistant to pesticides. All of these things are true. Okay, so we can't rely on the Green Revolution technology. As amazing as it will not carry us into the future. We have maxed it out. And so we've got to start doing other things. And so our real question is, can we continue to feed a growing population? Almost 1 billion people today are malnourished, and we'll be talking about this more later. There are famines all over the world, but they occur really frequently in sub-Saharan Africa. And while food production has doubled since the 1950s, we're going to have to double that production again to feed our population, which is still growing exponentially, right? So the real questions that we need to ask are, number one, how are we going to produce more food? But number two, what are the root causes of hunger? Okay, well, it turns out that it's actually not a lack of food. There is lots of food available. It's just not equally distributed in terms of the way that it's grown. Now, please know that I did not say that food distribution is the answer to the problem, okay? What I'm saying is that right now there are areas that could be more self-sustaining in their agriculture, and they are not. And then there are areas that grow lots and lots of food because they grow things well, okay? So what really causes hunger? Poverty, all right? Not enough money for newer, more efficient technologies, machinery, seeds, irrigation, okay? A lack of education, not understanding the best farming practices will really cut yields significantly. And so all over the world, especially in the developing world, you have really poor farming practices, and that is catastrophic in areas where you have people who are hungry, right? You're just not producing enough food, and that leads to the need for food aid. Now, lack of infrastructure is also a big deal. Governments in many developing nations fail to maintain water supplies and to provide the infrastructure for people to get water, and we're going to look at an example of this when we talk about food security. But that is one of the responsibilities of a government is to manage resources, to manage the country's resources, and many governments just don't do it very well, right? And roads are another thing that local, state, and sometimes federal governments also are supposed to oversee, at least in modern systems. And the roads to distribute food to the poor the roads to distribute food are poor, or they're non-existent, and so you can't get food in or out really easily. And imported food turns out to not be the answer. First of all, poor transportation, the same problem that we just talked about with lack of infrastructure, is going to be there is going to cause a problem with food aid distribution. Political instability can be a real problem for food shipments. Food can often be or the food distribution can be inhibited, to be disrupted by corrupt local officials, and unfortunately that happens way more than you think it does. To just import food in general for sale can be very expensive, right? And so we're really talking about two things. We're talking about food aid, and we're talking about food imports, right? So there's two things, commercial for sale imports. So there's two things with imported food. But whatever happens, when you're talking about imported food, you are talking about a country that has a lack of food security, right? If they are relying on feeding people with imported food, whether it's for sale or for just aid, right? You're talking about a lack of food security. Okay, so which of the following is not true about most farmers in LDCs? The staple crop is the chief source of food. Labor is underutilized except for planting and harvesting seasons. Cultivators farm only as much as their land only as much land as their families can work without hired labor. And on the traditional farm, output is always greater than consumption. Well, it turns out that on the traditional farm, output is not greater than consumption. And so subsistence farming, remember, is about producing what you can eat, what your family can grow. You can't hire people typically because you cannot afford that, right? You're going to be dealing with planting and harvesting. What are you doing in the meantime? And whatever your staple crop is, that's what you're going to be eating. And so if it's not the healthiest crop, if you're growing only rice, then you're going to be eating predominantly rice, and then you're not getting all of the other vitamins, minerals, and fats, proteins that you need, right? So output not greater than consumption. Okay, so and that was about LDCs. So why do farmers face economic difficulties? Well, when you're talking about subsistence farming, population growth is a big deal, right? More people means less available land per person. You also have international trade. What if you are growing a little bit extra and it's actually cheaper to import food, or you're competing with food aid supplies that are being sold on the black market, right? That's a problem. And then also drug crops. This is an opium poppy field in Afghanistan. There was a program to try and get people to grow food instead of drugs, and it was completely unsuccessful because, frankly, lettuce does not cost the same in terms of the market value as heroin, right? And so there's a huge economic incentive to grow things that are not food crops, right? And that is a huge problem. And it's a really big question. How do you overcome that? Because that's two issues. One, more drugs, which is bad, and two, less food, which is also bad. And then what about commercial farmers? I mean, commercial farmers have economic difficulties as well, right? Access to markets. You going back to that von Thunen model, right? Your choice of crop is going to be related to the proximity to the market. Like, how close are you to the market? What's going to be the best crop for you to grow? Now, in commercial, in the developed world, overproduction can be a problem. You can actually produce too much, which means that you flood the market with that product. Demand, fortunately, is relatively constant for things, but the result is that food is fairly cheap in the developed world, and that results in a low income for farmers, right? And you've got that market fluctuation too, don't forget. The cost of inputs and seeds is really high. Even if you're an organic farmer, you've still got to have all of that, the organic fertilizers, organic pesticides, and you still have to buy non-GMO, heritage type seeds. So organic versus inorganic, the cost of inputs and seeds, all really high. And then we're overusing land. We don't always farm it well, and so we have a loss of arable land, and that is global, regardless of whether you're subsistence or commercial. All right, so which of the following is not true? Fertilizers can maintain soil fertility and productivity into the distant future, even if the soil is eroding. Soil erosion is occurring throughout most of the densely inhabited regions of the world. Soil that's eroded could take centuries to be replaced. Loss of soil combined with exponential population growth could lead to serious food shortages. Both the direct and indirect cost of soil erosion is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide. Well, the first one is not true. Fertilizers can only do so much, but if the soil is eroding, you're losing the good soil and it just cannot be maintained. So what do we do about this? We have to come up with strategies to increase the food supply, and that's what the Future of Agriculture video notes will be about. But we need to expand agricultural land. How do we do that? Because there are huge environmental issues with it. And then there's the marginal land idea. I mean, how do you do that? We need to increase productivity. We essentially need to double the green revolution. So how can we do that again? And we need to identify new food sources, whether that's cultivating in oceans, developing higher protein grain crops, improving the taste of things that we don't like right now. That's the palatability of foods. So we start eating other things. How do we do that? Those are all really good questions, and those are questions that people are asking. But right now, biotechnology is going to be the way that we solve these problems. And whether it's through GM crops and livestock, cultured foods, alternative farmlands, we're going to have to figure out something. So that'll be the subject of the next video notes. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know in class or write them on the video notes question boards, and I will see you next time.